Danny Rourke and his crew thought they were untouchable, ruling Liverpool's docks with fear and greed. But one bold heist against the Colombian Cartel would turn their world upside down, setting the stage for a brutal, deadly revenge that no one would survive. Liverpool in the 1990s was a city in transition. The shipping docks that once carried steel, cotton, and tobacco now brought containers filled with goods from every corner of the globe. Hidden among the legal trade, smugglers moved weapons, drugs, and counterfeit products, taking advantage of weak security and desperate dockworkers willing to look the other way for cash. It was in this environment that Danny Rourke first learned how power could be built in the shadows. He grew up near the docks, surrounded by poverty, unemployment, and the constant pull of street crime. For many in his neighborhood, quick money was the only path out, and Danny was a boy who watched and learned faster than most. He started small, running errands for older gang members, delivering packages and stealing cars. By his late teens, he had a reputation as someone who never backed down and never talked to police, no matter the pressure. That loyalty earned him protection from bigger names in Liverpool's underworld. But Danny wasn't content to be a runner. He wanted control, and he wanted it early. He began adding his own crew, recruiting restless young men who were eager to prove themselves. They started with petty thefts, snatching electronics, cigarettes, and alcohol from the docks, but soon graduated to bigger hauls. Every score brought in more money, and every bit of money tightened Danny's hold on his neighborhood. The turning point came when Danny used his street connections to move into drugs. At first, it was just small bags of cannabis passed to students and nightclubbers, but within a year he had connections to suppliers bringing cocaine into the city. Liverpool was a perfect entry point for the drug trade. A busy port, cheap access to shipping, and countless bars and clubs where demand was constant. Danny seized the opportunity, building reliable distribution lines across the city. His rise was fast, and his name became known far beyond his own streets. What made Danny stand out wasn't just his ruthlessness, but his ambition. While many local gang leaders were satisfied with a steady income, Danny reinvested his profits into expanding operations. He bribed dockworkers, paid off low-level customs officials, and developed a system to track when shipments were arriving. His crew was no longer a group of reckless youths. It had transformed into an organized network that operated like a business. By his mid-20s, Danny was already considered one of the city's most dangerous figures. For the community around him, Danny was both feared and admired. Families struggling to pay rent saw him hand out cash for groceries. Young men without opportunities saw him driving expensive cars and wearing gold watches, living proof that the rules of ordinary life could be broken. Police officers, however, knew him as a constant threat. Raids on his properties rarely found more than scraps of evidence, and witnesses were too terrified to speak. Each failed attempt to bring him down only strengthened the myth of Danny Rourke, the dockside hustler who had risen to become a kingpin. Behind the myth, though, was a man driven by something darker than wealth alone. Danny had grown up seeing how power dictated everything. Who was respected, who was ignored, and who survived. From the start, he believed that money without fear meant nothing. He built his empire not only on deals and shipments, but also on intimidation. Rivals who refused to cooperate saw their businesses burned. Street dealers who shorted his crew disappeared overnight. By the late 1990s, Liverpool's underworld had a new ruler, and his name was spoken with both awe and caution. Danny Rourke was no longer just a product of the docks, he was the king of them. By the early 2000s, Danny Rourke had achieved what most local gang leaders only dreamed of. His network stretched across Liverpool, feeding cocaine into bars, clubs, and neighborhoods where demand was insatiable. The profits were staggering, but for Danny, being rich wasn't enough. He wanted to be untouchable. That meant cutting out middlemen, dealing directly with the source, and securing a position not just as a buyer but as a true power player in the global drug trade. His hunger for more began with whispers he heard around the dock. Corrupt workers spoke of containers arriving from South America, loaded with fruit, coffee, or textiles, but hiding something far more valuable: bricks of pure cocaine. Until then, Danny had relied on established European distributors. These suppliers charged high prices, taking their cut and leaving him with thinner margins than he liked. Every time he handed over money, he felt he was enriching someone else while limiting his own control. The idea of going straight to the source gripped him. If he could intercept even one container, he would be swimming in profit. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about respect. To take what was meant for the Colombians themselves would be an audacious act, a move that would put him on the map in ways no one could ignore. Temptation grew as Danny learned more about how shipments moved. Dockers were underpaid and often drowning in debt, making them easy to bribe. Security cameras didn't cover every corner, and once containers were unloaded, it was chaos on the ground, with paperwork often shuffled or lost. Danny realized that the docks were a playground for those bold enough to exploit them. He began quietly paying for information, gathering details about schedules, shipping routes, and the weaknesses in port security. The more he discovered, the more convinced he became that the Colombians weren't invincible. They had built a system for profit, not for war. Yet even as he planned, Danny understood the risks. Robbing a cartel wasn't like muscling out a local gang or scaring a street dealer. This was an organization with global reach, known for making enemies disappear in ways that left behind nothing but fear. But Danny's pride blinded him. He told himself that the Colombians wouldn't even know who had taken the load. To them, it would look like a simple dockside theft, just one of many losses in a global trade. He convinced himself he could stay invisible, hidden behind layers of intermediaries, while pocketing the reward. In private moments, though, he felt the weight of what he was about to do. He had climbed high in Liverpool's underworld, but the higher he rose, the thinner the air became. Trust was harder to come by, paranoia crept in, and the stakes grew deadlier with every deal. Still, temptation always won. Danny was addicted to risk as much as he was addicted to wealth. To him, danger was proof of power. If he could pull this off, it would prove that he wasn't just another kingpin. He would be the man who took from the Colombians and lived to tell the tale. That dangerous thought became an obsession. The more he imagined the shipment falling into his hands, the more reckless his planning became. He gathered his most loyal crew and began sketching the outline of what would become the boldest move of his life. Danny was no longer satisfied with ruling Liverpool. He wanted to challenge the very giants of the trade. The temptation had turned into a decision, and once Danny made up his mind, there was no turning back. The night of the heist arrived with a chill in the air, the kind of damp cold that clung Liverpool's streets and settled in the bones. Danny Rourke had planned every detail for weeks. He knew exactly when the container would dock, which workers could be relied on to look the other way, and how long he had before anyone noticed something was missing. To him, this wasn't just another job. It was a defining moment, the line that would separate him from the rest of the city's underworld. If it worked, he would be sitting on a fortune and a reputation that stretched across continents. If it failed, the consequences were unthinkable. Danny's crew gathered in an abandoned warehouse near the port hours before the shipment arrived. These were not reckless teenagers anymore, but hardened men who owed their loyalty to Danny. Each of them knew the risks. Rumors of cartel violence had circulated for years, stories of entire families wiped out, bodies left in pieces as warnings. But Danny's confidence was infectious. He convinced them that with precision, speed, and silence, they could outsmart anyone. He promised them wealth beyond their wildest expectations. That night, greed outweighed fear. When the ship docked, the city slept under the cover of darkness. Trucks lined the port, forklifts moved in the distance, and container cranes groaned under the weight of cargo. Danny's inside men, 2 dock workers and a security guard, were already in place. With falsified documents, the targeted container was quietly shifted out of its designated lane and redirected toward the waiting trucks. To anyone watching, it looked like a routine procedure, just another shipment among thousands. In reality, it carried over 200 kilograms of pure cocaine, sealed inside crates of imported bananas. The operation unfolded with a calm efficiency that surprised even Danny. His men moved quickly, breaking open the crates to confirm the contents. White bricks wrapped tightly in plastic glistened under the dim light of the warehouse. Each one represented tens of thousands of pounds on the street. Together, they were worth millions. For a moment, silence hung in the air as the crew stared at their prize. It was more cocaine than most of them had ever seen at once. The magnitude of what they had just taken sank in slowly, followed by a rush of adrenaline. By dawn, the container was gone, the evidence erased. The dockworkers returned to their shifts as if nothing had happened, while the trucks carrying the cocaine disappeared into the city's industrial outskirts. Danny distributed the load into safe houses, breaking it down into smaller packages for distribution. To him, the heist had been a flawless success. No alarms, no gunfire, no signs of discovery. It was the kind of operation that could make legends. But what Danny failed to recognize was the nature of the enemy he had just crossed. The Colombians did not see losses as simple business setbacks. Every shipment represented not only money but also power and reputation. When someone dared to steal, it was never forgiven, no matter how far across the world the thief tried to hide. For now, Danny celebrated, blind to the shadow he had just invited over his empire. The heist was complete, but the true cost had only begun. At first, the heist seemed like the greatest triumph of Danny Rourke's career. The cocaine was distributed across Liverpool, Manchester, and beyond, flooding the market with supply so pure that rival gangs couldn't compete. Profits soared, cash came in faster than it could be counted, and Danny basked in the glow of victory. To outsiders, it looked as though he had achieved the impossible. He had taken from the Colombians, yet no one had come knocking. To his crew, it felt like they were untouchable, kings in a city already known for its criminal history. But beneath that false sense of security, something far darker was unfolding. The Colombians didn't move quickly. They didn't scream or send frantic messages demanding answers. They watched. In the weeks after the theft, subtle signals began to emerge. Men Danny didn't recognize appeared in Liverpool's nightclubs, quietly observing who came and went. Anonymous tips began landing on police desks, leading to sudden raids on properties linked to Danny's rivals. It looked on the surface like bad luck for other gangs, but the truth was simpler. The cartel was narrowing its search, eliminating suspects one by one. Danny ignored the signs at first. He was too busy celebrating his new wealth, throwing lavish parties in secret mansions, wearing expensive watches, and driving imported cars that screamed success. His arrogance blinded him to the quiet storm gathering around him. Some of his closest associates urged caution, but Danny dismissed their concerns. To him, the Colombians were too far away, too busy managing global operations to care about a single container lost in Liverpool. That belief would prove fatal. Meanwhile, the cartel began to tighten its grip. A man in Danny's network disappeared on his way home. His car, later found abandoned near the docks. A small stash house in Manchester was raided by masked men, its guards executed with brutal precision. No one claimed responsibility, but the message was clear to those who understood the language of organized crime. Someone powerful was sending warnings. Danny's paranoia grew, but instead of slowing down, he doubled his operations, trying to prove he was still in control. Behind the scenes, the cartel was piecing everything together. Their system was ruthless and methodical. Shipping records were traced, corrupt workers interrogated, and whispers from local criminals bought with blood money. Every thread pointed back to Danny's network. Still, they did not strike immediately. Patience was one of their strongest weapons. While Danny's empire grew on the surface, underground, it was already being dismantled piece by piece. The silent storm didn't just target Danny's business, it infected his crew with fear. Men who had once followed him without question now wondered if their leader had doomed them all. Some started hiding their money, others quietly reached out to rivals for protection. Trust began to erode. Danny, once celebrated for his boldness, found himself isolated. He had always believed power came from daring to take what others feared to touch. But in stealing from the Colombians, he had broken an unwritten law of the criminal world: never cross those who hold the bigger gun. The calm before the storm was almost worse than an open war. Danny could feel it, even if he refused to admit it. Every time he stepped outside, he felt eyes on him. Every time a phone rang, he wondered if the voice on the other end was his betrayer. Liverpool buzzed with rumors, but no one dared to say them aloud. The city knew what Danny still struggled to accept: the Colombians had marked him, and when their strike finally came, it would be absolute. The first cracks in Danny Rourke's empire appeared slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A shipment that had been carefully planned went missing, vanishing somewhere between Liverpool and Manchester. It was a small quantity compared to the massive heist months earlier, but it sent shockwaves through Danny's crew. Questions were asked in hushed tones, fingers were pointed, and for the first time, loyalty wavered. Men who had once followed Danny without hesitation now glanced over their shoulders, wondering if the Colombian Cartel's reach had already touched their city. Danny, however, refused to show fear. He insisted it was a minor setback, blaming logistics and careless drivers, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Soon after, the body of one of Danny's closest lieutenants was discovered in a deserted parking lot. He had been executed with the precision of trained professionals. No struggle, no mistakes, just a cold, calculated murder that left everyone unsettled. The brutality of the killing made it clear that this was not the work of a local gang. The message was unmistakable: someone was watching, someone with power, patience, and lethal efficiency. Danny tried to reassure himself that he could still control the situation, but paranoia crept in. Every knock on the door, every stranger in a car outside a safe house, triggered anxiety that gnawed at him day and night. The pressure didn't stop with violence. Police surveillance around Danny's operations intensified. Seemingly coincidental at first, he noticed cameras installed near his usual routes and checkpoints that seemed unusually persistent. Although he suspected the authorities, deep down he knew the real threat was the cartel. The Colombians had the ability to manipulate law enforcement, using bribed officers and informants to keep tabs on him without ever directly revealing themselves. Danny's mind became a battlefield of suspicion, strategizing on how to stay one step ahead, yet constantly feeling that he was falling behind. Internal cracks began to form as well. Some of Danny's trusted men started questioning his decisions. They worried that his obsession with outsmarting the cartel was clouding his judgment. Arguments over loyalty, money, and risk escalated quietly behind closed doors. One associate disappeared for days, only to return with tales of threats made by shadowy figures, warnings meant for Danny. Fear had infiltrated the crew, and Danny could feel the loyalty he had once commanded slipping through his fingers. Danny's paranoia led him to take extreme measures. Safe houses were changed daily, routes to meet distributors were altered constantly, and meetings were held in secret locations scattered across Liverpool. He believed that mobility and unpredictability would keep him safe. Yet the more he ran, the more isolated he became. Even his closest allies began to hesitate, unsure if following him meant survival or certain death. His empire, which had once been a symbol of power and invincibility, was now a fragile network under siege from an enemy that moved silently but with deadly purpose. Despite the mounting threats, Danny refused to surrender. He continued his operations, distributing drugs and collecting money, clinging to the illusion of control. But every lost shipment, every mysterious death, and every suspicious glance reminded him that the walls were closing in. The city that once feared and admired him was now filled with whispers of doom. Liverpool's Kingpin had built an empire on audacity and fear, but the same forces that had made him unstoppable were now conspiring to destroy him. In the shadows, the cartel's silent campaign was beginning to pay off, leaving Danny with a terrifying realization: the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced was already inside his own world. Danny Rourke's downfall didn't come with a bang, it came with a whisper, a quiet betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet. For years, he had trusted his inner circle implicitly, believing loyalty could be bought with money, respect, and fear. But desperation has a way of turning even the most devoted allies into enemies. One of Danny's closest associates, a man who had grown up alongside him on the Liverpool docks, was drowning in debts he could not repay. The weight of unpaid loans and mounting threats made him vulnerable to outside influence, and the Colombian cartel recognized the opportunity immediately. The associate had been feeding information to Danny for years, a loyal lieutenant who knew every shipment, every safe house, every route. But fear and greed can change loyalty into treachery. Under pressure from the cartel and facing ruin, he quietly began passing details of Danny's movements, schedules, and contacts to the hitman waiting thousands of miles away. Each small piece of intelligence was like a spark in a dry forest, harmless on its own, but enough to set a fire that would consume everything. Danny remained oblivious, too wrapped up in paranoia over random threats and missing shipments to notice the betrayal at his side. He continued moving his crew from one safe house to another, altering routes and changing plans, thinking that unpredictability would keep them safe. But the cartel was always one step ahead. Every route he changed, every meeting he relocated, had already been anticipated. The inside information ensured that the Colombians could track his movements with surgical precision. As weeks passed, strange coincidences began piling up. A shipment would vanish without explanation, a trusted contact would suddenly disappear, and a loyal lieutenant would act suspiciously. Danny's paranoia intensified, yet he still could not identify the true source of the leak. He suspected everyone and trusted no one, but the real traitor remained hidden, quietly feeding the cartel the roadmap to his empire. The betrayal was invisible but lethal, like poison seeping into his veins. The cartel didn't need to attack immediately. Patience was their weapon. They let Danny continue operating, distributing drugs and collecting money, giving him a false sense of control. This prolonged period of apparent calm allowed them to prepare for the ultimate strike. Meanwhile, Danny's mental state began to fracture. Sleepless nights became routine. He obsessed over threats, real and imagined. Each day his empire felt less like a fortress and more like a house of cards, vulnerable to collapse from a single nudge. The betrayal reached its apex when Danny's location was finally confirmed. The associate had given away enough information for the Colombian hitman to pinpoint him to a single safe house in Toxteth. In the cartel's eyes, there was no need for further surveillance or indirect threats. The stage was set. The final act of Danny Rourke's reign would be executed with cold, precise efficiency. The man who had once ruled Liverpool's underworld with fear and cunning was about to be toppled, not by a rival gang or police, but by someone he had trusted above all else. The cruel irony was that Danny had always believed that loyalty was absolute when backed by power and fear. Yet in the criminal world, desperation and opportunity often outweigh even the strongest bonds. The betrayal was not loud, not dramatic, it was quiet, calculated and deadly. It was the kind of act that leaves no chance for redemption, no warning, and no second opportunity. The empire Danny had built was about to crumble from the inside, leaving him exposed to the relentless vengeance of the Colombian cartel. Rain slicked the streets of Liverpool the night Danny Rourke met his fate. The city was quiet, streetlights casting dull reflections across wet pavement, the kind of evening that felt ordinary to everyone, except the men lying in wait. Danny had spent the day moving between safe houses, convinced that constant motion would keep him alive. His paranoia had grown into ritual, never taking the same route twice, always checking mirrors, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. But no matter how many precautions he took, betrayal had already undone him. The cartel knew exactly where he was and where he would be next. Danny climbed into his car just after dusk, the engine humming softly as he pulled away from a modest brick house in Toxteth. He believed the location was secure, a temporary stop arranged only hours earlier. What he didn't realize was that the men who had orchestrated his downfall were already tracking his every move. As he drove toward the city center, he passed rows of shuttered shops and quiet terraced homes, unaware of the van that had slipped into the road behind him. Inside the van, armed men sat in silence, their faces blank, their task clear. At a red light, Danny's car slowed to a stop. It was a moment of vulnerability, one he had experienced countless times before, with his heart pounding, his eyes darting between rearview mirrors and passing vehicles. This time, there would be no escape. The van pulled up alongside him, its sliding door flung open in one swift motion. What followed was an eruption of violence unlike anything Liverpool had seen in years. Automatic weapons roared, sending a storm of bullets tearing through the car. Glass shattered, metal twisted, and the echo of gunfire thundered down the narrow street. Danny had no time to react. The ambush was over in seconds, his body riddled with wounds before he even understood what was happening. The precision was terrifying. Controlled bursts, no stray shots, no hesitation. Witnesses later described it as a military-style operation. Cold and professional, the attackers did not linger. The van sped off into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of Danny's car and the lifeless body of the man who once ruled Liverpool's underworld. Neighbors peered from windows, their faces pale with shock. Some dared to step outside, watching smoke curl from the bullet-ridden vehicle as sirens wailed in the distance. By the time emergency responders arrived, Danny was gone. The scene told its own story. This was no random shooting, no petty gang rivalry. It was an execution, planned with meticulous detail, carried out with ruthless efficiency. For the police, the attack was confirmation of what they had long suspected, that Danny's theft from the Colombians had triggered consequences beyond local law enforcement's control. For the underworld, it was a message carved in bullets. Nobody, no matter how feared or respected, could steal from the cartel and live. Danny's death was not just an ending, it was a demonstration. In a single night, the Kingpin of Liverpool was erased, and with him went the illusion of invincibility. The brutal hit left the city shaken, a grim reminder that in the drug trade, power is fleeting and betrayal is deadly. The Colombians had spoken in the only language they ever used, violence, and the message would echo long after Danny's blood was washed from the rain-soaked streets. Danny Rourke's death left a void in Liverpool's underworld that was both immediate and terrifying. For years, his name had been synonymous with power, fear, and wealth. He had ruled the docks with an iron fist, commanding loyalty through a mix of respect and intimidation. But in one calculated strike, the Colombian Cartel had shattered the illusion of invincibility that he had so carefully constructed. The city felt the tremors of his fall instantly. Rival gangs, once cautious in the shadow of Danny's empire, suddenly sensed opportunity. Territories that had been off-limits were now up for grabs, sparking quiet conflicts and uneasy alliances. Yet, the immediate scramble for power was overshadowed by fear. Everyone who had ever worked with Danny or even known him understood the implications of his execution. This was more than a murder, it was a warning. The Colombians had demonstrated that their reach extended far beyond South America, that they could strike anywhere with precision and ruthlessness. Whispers spread among Liverpool's criminal circles, not about potential revenge or retaliation, but about survival. The lesson was stark: stealing from the cartel meant certain death. Even those who had opposed Danny now hesitated, aware that the same fate could await them if they overstepped. Danny's former crew disbanded quickly. Some fled the city, taking whatever cash or goods they could carry. Others attempted to integrate into rival networks, hoping that alliances and loyalty to new leaders would shield them. A few were quietly eliminated, victims of the same ruthless calculus that had claimed Danny. The empire that had once seemed unshakable collapsed almost overnight, leaving behind scattered assets, abandoned safe houses, and a trail of fear that would linger for years. The media, though careful not to name the cartel directly, covered the execution extensively. News outlets described it as one of the most brutal hits in Liverpool's criminal history. Police statements were cautious, hinting at organized crime involvement without confirming specifics. Social commentators dissected the rise and fall of Danny Rourke, painting him as both a product and a victim of a globalized underworld, where ambition and greed often led to catastrophic consequences. His story was repeated in bars, homes, and back alleys, a cautionary tale of hubris, betrayal, and the lethal consequences of crossing the wrong people. In the months that followed, the city adjusted to a new reality. Crime networks reorganized, with smaller groups trying to claim fragments of Danny's former territory. Yet, the shadow of the Colombian cartel remained. People acted more discreetly, operations became quieter, and the sense of omnipotence that Danny had once projected vanished. Even those who had previously dismissed the cartel as distant and untouchable now moved with extreme caution. Danny's legacy was paradoxical. On one hand, he had achieved incredible wealth, power, and notoriety, becoming a legendary figure in Liverpool's criminal history. On the other hand, his ambition had blinded him to the limits of his control, leading to a downfall so absolute that it became a defining story of the dangers inherent in the drug trade. His life and death illustrated the unforgiving nature of criminal hierarchies, where loyalty can be bought, betrayal is inevitable, and power without caution is fleeting. Years later, the story of Danny Rourke is still told as a warning. Young criminals hear it as a lesson in ambition and arrogance. Law enforcement studies it as a case in organized crime and cartel influence. For the ordinary citizen, it is a chilling reminder that beneath the familiar streets and bright city lights, a world of violence, betrayal, and fear can exist, completely invisible until it strikes with sudden brutal clarity. Danny Rourke's empire is gone, but the echoes of his rise and violent fall continue to haunt Liverpool, leaving a legacy of fear that may never fade.